So imagine this. A major global power is seemingly backed into a corner, facing a massive crisis with its most important ally. But what if, at that exact same moment, it was secretly engineering one of the biggest economic transformations in its own history? Well, that is the incredible story we're diving into today. Okay, let's just start with a number 50%. Picture yourself as one of the fastest growing economies on the planet. And then, bam, overnight, your single biggest trading partner slaps a crippling 50% tariff on almost everything you sell them. What do you do? Do you panic? Do you fold? Well, what actually happened in late 2025 was a whole lot more interesting. So, here's how we're going to break this all down. First, we'll look at that high-stakes standoff with the US. Then, we're going to pivot to the revolution that was happening inside India's own economy. After that, we'll see the absolute explosion of domestic capital that followed. And finally, we're going to connect all the dots and ask, what does this all mean for the world? All right, so our story really kicks off in August of 2025. The relationship between the US and India, one that had been carefully built up for decades, it suddenly just hits a brick wall, and it hits it hard. The speed of this escalation was just wild. On August 1st, the Trump administration hits India with a 25% tariff. But then, not even 4 weeks later, on August 27th, they double down, tacking on another 25%. That brought the total to a staggering 50%, the highest tariff on any major U.S. trading partner.
So the big question is, why? Well, this is where you see this huge disconnect. The official U.S. reasons were things like India buying Russian oil and its role in the BRICS group. But a lot of analysts pointed to President Trump's frustration after India shot down his claim about mediating a ceasefire with Pakistan. On the other side, India was basically saying, look, Russian oil is a necessity for our 1.4 billion people, and our foreign policy is all about strategic autonomy. We don't pick sides.
And this move just sent shockwaves around the world. I mean, you had prominent voices like Fareed Zakaria calling it a massive strategic blunder, something that threw away years of work from both Democrats and Republicans to build a strong partnership with India. And it wasn't just journalists either. You had former top officials like Nikki Haley warning that blowing up the relationship with the only viable counterbalance to China in Asia was nothing short of a strategic disaster. Basically handing an advantage to Beijing. So how did India respond? Well, they were swift and they were defiant. The government called the tariffs unfair, unjustified, and unreasonable. And the commerce minister went on record saying India would not bow down. The battle lines were officially drawn. So this puts India in a really tough spot, right? I mean, with your biggest partner in crisis and almost 3/4 of your exports to them at risk, you've got to wonder, was the country about to be forced into a corner? Not even close. Because while this huge storm was raging on the international stage, a quiet but incredibly powerful revolution was happening inside India's own borders. And this is where the story gets really fascinating. Right in the middle of this massive trade crisis, the Indian government was pushing through some of the most ambitious economic reforms in its history. And believe me, this was no coincidence. So first up was something called the Securities Markets Code. Think of this as a giant spring cleaning of India's financial laws. They took 3 complicated, really old acts and merged them into one single, modern rulebook. The goals here were pretty clear. Make it way easier to do business, give better protection to small investors, and build what the government started calling financial self-reliance. But that was just the appetizer. At the exact same time, another truly monumental shift was underway. The government passed a bill that ended a 60-year-old state monopoly, opening up the nuclear power sector to private companies for the very first time. Now, the key piece of tech this unlocked was something called small modular reactors, or SMRs. Basically, you can think of these as compact, factory-built nuclear reactors. They're perfect for providing that 24/7 carbon-free power that things like huge data centers and the whole AI industry are so hungry for. And almost right away, you had big players like the Adani Group announcing a massive 1.6 gigawatt project. So you've got these 2 huge reforms happening at once, modernizing the financial system and unlocking a new energy source. And that created the perfect conditions for what came next, an absolute boom in domestic investment, led by a kind of IPO gold rush. And the sheer scale of this boom was just staggering. In 2025 alone, with that whole U.S. trade crisis happening in the background, Indian startups raised nearly 33,000 crore rupees. To put that in perspective, that's about $4 billion US,
all raised through public offerings on their own domestic stock exchanges. And this chart shows you who was cashing in. Some of the biggest venture capital firms saw massive returns. But here's the really crucial part. This wasn't just about a few companies getting rich. This was proof, absolute proof, that India's domestic market was now deep enough to give huge paydays to early investors. They were becoming less and less reliant on foreign capital. Okay, so now we get to the final part, where we pull these two threads together, the crisis on the outside and the boom on the inside, and try to understand the bigger strategy that was at play. What you're really looking at here are two competing worldviews clashing head-on. On one side, you have the America First policy, which uses tariffs as a tool and focuses on trade balances above all else. And on the other, you have India's long-standing policy of strategic autonomy, which is all about balancing relationships while building up internal economic muscle as the ultimate defense against outside pressure. Those domestic reforms, they were a direct response to the geopolitical challenge.
And, this clash had real consequences. The Quad Summit, a cornerstone of the U.S.-India alliance, was postponed indefinitely. U.S. allies like Australia and Germany were getting nervous. And here's a telling detail. As the U.S. market got tougher, India's exports to China shot up by 90% in a single month. It's no wonder experts were calling it the worst crisis in the relationship in 20 years. Which really brings us to the big final question. As these old alliances are tested, is India actually building a future based on its own internal strength? A future where it's so resilient that it doesn't have to choose sides between the world's competing powers, because it can just forge its own path? So, what do you think? Is this a sustainable strategy for the long run, or is it a really risky gamble? We'd love to know what you think, so drop your thoughts in the comments below. And hey, if you found this breakdown useful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives. Thanks for watching.